Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Ask podcast, where we sincerely hope you'll be attaining some secret knowledge with the assistance of our fantastic teachers and staff at John Hampden Grammar School in High Wycombe. Just to remind you, I'm Jenny Summers, Deputy Head of English and Drama at the school. And I'm hoping for a truly cross-curricular exploration today. I can't resist. We might be doing some links to Macbeth, so watch out for that. And here's my delightful co-host.
And I'm Mark Till. And if you listened last time and you're listening this time, then we love you. Not in a weird way, in a perfectly normal way. And here is your second clue. So if you listened last week, you'd have had the first clue, and I thought we'd do this week's clue at the very beginning. Your second clue for people looking to make a cryptic connection between these things is Austin. Your second clue is Austin, as in Austen. So not the city in Texas, but the novelist in Hampshire. That is your second clue. And you might, if you're listening, you won't know, but we've invested this week in lots of elaborate props. We have, not to anticipate what our theme is, but we're doing this around a huge bubbling cauldron. We've got pointy hats. There's a cat in the corner just behind you. No expense has been spared at all. In some ways, it's a shame we're not filming it, because we've gone to so much expense and trouble with the props.
Well, on that note, we're also joined by 3 wizards of sixth form. We have Tom, our producer extraordinaire, who terribly I forgot to thank for his fantastic job he's done, but I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm Tom. I study maths, physics, further maths and music, but I've got an interest in all sorts of things, and there's a good element of medicine actually in the history of witchcraft, so that's what drew me in. I'm the producer, but I'd like to also thank our lovely audio team and Aman, who isn't here with us today, but will be at some point.
Sounds very
He is still alive for the record. Aman is good.
He has not died. Producing the podcast wasn't that difficult last time.
Oh dear. And we've got Ewan, a true polymath, if I may say, and total gentleman.
Thank you very much, Mom. Yes, I'm Ewan. I study, similarly to Tom, maths, further maths, physics, and I also study politics, so I hope that makes me somewhat qualified to not interrogate Mom, but ask Mom some questions. And it's a really interesting subject of hers.
Quaking in her boots.
Interrogate's fine. We'll go with interrogate.
We did say
for witchcraft, interrogating is definitely
true. And then we've got returning panellist Dan, the master of rhetoric.
I'm Dan. I study history, politics and English, although I won't be interrogating Mum. I'm much nicer than Ewan. And I also do debating frequently.
Fantastic.
Nice.
And today we're going to be travelling back in time to examine the world of witchcraft in the 16th and 17th centuries. I have some questions bubbling in my mind already. Do they really meet in thunder, lightning or in rain? Were people really drowned to test whether they were a witch or not? Could a man be a witch? I'm sure we'll be covering all of this today when we're attaining our secret knowledge. And most importantly, we have our multi-talented guest today. This is Mrs Helen Livingstone. She is a phenomenon. She not only teaches history, she also is capable of teaching religious studies and maths. So my mind boggles at the idea of that combination of subjects. So let me start off and jump straight in and say, why witchcraft and why does that leave you spellbound, Mum? Sorry, I couldn't help that.
I feel like I'm not going to be able to keep up with the level of puns here. Just going to set that out. Witchcraft. Well, so I've been interested in witchcraft since university. I studied a module on it and I was kind of hooked at that point. And I just think it's a really interesting way of getting into the lives of people that you wouldn't normally get into, because normally what you have access to is court records. You have, as in the King's Court, you have access to the people who were literate, who could read and write, who could tell you about their lives, or whose lives were particularly interesting to the people around them. But you don't get a huge amount of insight into the lives of ordinary people and what ordinary people believed, and particularly women. Whereas with witchcraft trials, it is predominantly, certainly in England, predominantly women who were accused, but also predominantly women who were accusing them. So you get through the court now talking about, as in trials, through the court records, you get a lot of women's voices. And I guess the other thing to say is it's just something that's kind of fascinating. You know, we all talk about, you know, Macbeth and Harry Potter and all sorts of fictional wizards and witches. And I guess I was kind of intrigued to see if there was and where there was crossover.
Fantastic.
Let's start with some questions. Where do you think, obviously, the whole idea of sorcery comes up in the Bible, but we see witchcraft in loads of other cultures. Where do you think it sort of originated from in terms of England?
So in terms of England, there was a crime of witchcraft or sorcery back into the medieval ages, but it tended to be quite a political crime, and so it was committed by women and some men. So there was a mother-in-law of one of the kings of England who was accused of witchcraft when it was more of a political crime and linked to treason. But it became what I would associate with witchcraft in sort of the 16th century. There was a lot written about it, sort of just before the Reformation, and then it was picked up on and dispersed around Europe. So it was kind of started in Germany, and there was a book particularly in 1480 something called the Malleus Maleficarum, which means the hammer of the witches, and that is probably the tome that started off the idea of witchcraft being a common crime.
Because arguably, would you say it created a sense of paranoia? Because if you look at it in the grand scheme of things, these superstitions, these thoughts of, you know, widespread people across the world, what factors caused this to spread on such a quick and wide-scale basis?
Well, that we could be here for ages to go through. My answer would be the Reformation. My big answer would be that for Protestants, they were trying to clamp down on Catholic superstition, and actually the Catholic Church was trying to clamp down on Catholic superstition as well, because they could see that people were turning away from what they saw as the true church. So actually the Reformation creates a space where people are paranoid. They're paranoid about the religion that those around them are following. They are worried about what is true religion, and they are very keen to demonstrate their own religiosity.
And do you think, obviously, King James's demonology, a massive dissertation, do you think the fact that the king had such a fascination with the topic, do you think that helped propagate it around the country?
Perhaps, although by the 17th century you've already had a couple of sort of outbreaks of witchcraft. It's been ongoing since the mid-16th century, and the 1580s in particular, there's an outbreak of witchcraft. There is obviously then the demonology prompts another wave, but the other big wave you see in England actually isn't until the 1640s, which was a good few years.
Well, there, I think there are 5 great Scottish witch hunts over sort of 200 years.
Well, you've got to be a bit careful. English witchcraft is quite different to Scottish witchcraft. Scottish witchcraft is more similar to German witchcraft.
Tell us more, Mum.
Well,
please do.
Can't tease us.
So what are the types of things then that people were accused of being witches for? What types of things sort of got them in this situation?
Okay, where?
England, we'll start with.
Okay.
And then how does it differ?
Did the Scottish witches want independence?
Possibly so. I mean, it was around the time that the James had united the kingdoms of England and England and Scotland.
How were they different?
The witchcraft.
Yeah.
So we can go back to Dan's question, and that leads quite nicely into yours. So in England, the crimes are kind of similar. So in England, your butter didn't churn, you killed someone's cow, you put a curse on their life, and possibly, that was the extreme of killing. But in England, you would be arrested for someone's butter not churning or their cow dying, and that would be the accusation. So the trial would go something along the lines of, so you made a pact with the devil. Yeah, I did that, right, and what did the devil get you to do? I used his power to kill my neighbour's cow. You killed a cow. Yeah, that was what I did. Right, well, that's a felony, so for that you shall be hanged.
Wow.
Whereas in Germany, you get similar things, although on a massively bigger scale. They really went to town with it in Germany. But the conversation went more along the lines of, so, you used the power of the devil. Yes. To kill a cow. Yeah, that was what I did. But you used the power of the devil. Yes. And what did you do with the devil? What deal did you make with him? How did you get his power? You are in league with the devil. And for that, you will be burned.
Wow.
So the difference comes in whether you look at it as a felony or whether you look at it as a diabolic pact.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when I was looking into this, they kind of pounced on the smallest little things, and I saw that even Joan of Arc was kind of tried for the visions which she had, which arguably contributed to the victory, the end of the 100 Years' War, and later Joan of Arc was obviously sadly burned at the stake for...
Yeah, which I think is a really interesting illustration of what I was talking about earlier, where in the sort of 13th century, 14th, 15th century, witchcraft was a political crime which was essentially used to get rid of people that you didn't want, that you thought were threatening your power. Joan of Arc being a really good example of that. How could a woman be in this position of power? Well, she must have used witchcraft to get there.
And is that why you see, so in the Scottish witch hunt you could see sort of 400 people killed very quickly?
Yeah.
Is because of this, it seeing it as a religious person, somebody going astray from the Christian religion at that point.
Yeah, so then what that leads on to is, well, if you've made a pact with the devil, it is fully legitimate for us to torture you. Because
legally binding contract.
well, that sort of thing. Yeah, exactly. So because actually you are threatening us with the devil himself. What worse could there be? So fully okay to torture you. And what we're also going to do whilst we're torturing you is we're going to ask who else you were in league with, because the devil doesn't just want one person; he wants all the souls. Yeah, so you're probably also, because you have these cosy chats with the devil. He'll have told you who else he's in league with. So we're gonna torture the names out of you. You're looking a bit dumbfounded.
No, I'm just thinking: is there evidence? Someone who's looked at a lot of these trials transcripts and the written evidence that's available, an insight into whether those who were accused, on some level, were they confessing because they'd been tortured? Obviously some were. Did any of them actually believe themselves that they were witches?
Yeah, I think so. It's really difficult to tell quite a lot of the time, because even in England, where torture itself wasn't used, actually they were kept in some pretty nasty conditions, and things like sleep deprivation and just the psychological trauma, essentially, of being in that position would have been really difficult to deal with. But certainly some people would have believed that they had certain powers. If we think about medicine, if we think about kind of white witchcraft or healing folk, there is clearly some belief there that they had the power to do good. So certainly whether people really believed that they were killing other people's cows and children and things like that, probably to a certain extent.
And on the topic of white witches as well, sort of what set someone different from a witch and a healing person, and how could a healing person become a witch, become deemed a witch?
An accusation, essentially.
Simple as that.
Yeah. If you tried to heal someone, it went wrong, that could result in an accusation. There actually isn't loads of crossover between the two. It's something that I looked at quite a lot in university, and there's not loads of crossover. There is a bit, but actually people tend to accuse you of being a witch rather than you being a white witch or a healer, and then accused. And there is a really interesting case actually where the powers that be decided that a woman was a witch, and pretty much the whole community turned out and said, no, she's not, she healed me, she made me better. And in that instance, actually wasn't taken into account and she was executed.
Oh, no.
I know, it's really sad that. But, so there were instances of crossover, but quite often not so much.
So was the accusation itself basically a death sentence, or like how many people who were accused as a proportion, say, sort of got actually executed for it?
I've got genuinely no idea.
Okay. Fair enough.
But it depends how far you got in the process. If one person, your next door neighbour, said, oh, she's a witch, then probably not too much was going to come of it. If you've got whole communities saying it, or in some cases when you get quite powerful people accusing others of witchcraft, then it becomes more of an issue. And also if you are obviously accused by another witch, then that's pretty grim for you.
And how do you think, obviously we're not as we don't accuse our teachers of being witch and burning them at a stake.
Not yet, but
Not
education gets reformed very frequently. So
Yes, well that's our goal as
whether
a
that's still
generation.
the case.
But how do you think that sort of left the popular belief? Because it was quite, widespread. How do you think that, it became a thing that we're not burning people at a stake as so much?
So how did the craze end? Is what
Yes.
you're saying?
As a non-historian, my answer for that is I always think that was Elizabeth I, who takes some of the heat out of the religious conflict. But we have an actual historian. Am I right or wrong? Because isn't it Elizabeth I who says we won't make windows into men's souls? There's a sense that if it is fanned by the flames of the Protestant Reformation, that things settle down a little bit then.
How sarcastic can I be in my
Oh dear. Trouble, sir.
This is why I do this podcast. I have my ignorance counted.
Did James I come before or after?
Yeah, I was about to say
that.
that.
That is a fair point.
Essentially, people just stop believing. It was still a crime until 1736 in England, which is quite late, really. I feel.
Yeah.
That's 250, 300 years ago. So not actually that long ago. And gradually, people stop accusing people, but more the powers that are prosecuting are not willing to do so. So there are still cases brought, but they are quite quickly thrown out of court.
And so on the topic of James, King James, so you see his effect with the demonology on Shakespeare. Do you think there was a particular effect in the sort of media of the time? Do you think witchcraft was something everybody was thinking about, or is it just something that happened, people accused and in communities? Or
yeah, I think quite a few people were thinking about it. I mean, there's a lot of people after the Malleus. A lot of people then write treatises. There's a brilliant one written in the 1580s, so just before King James, which basically says you're all completely bonkers. What are you talking about? Like, this woman has come from a hovel at the end of your village. How on earth does she have the power of the devil? And if she had the power of the devil, surely she wouldn't still be in a hovel at the end of your village. And it's quite good. So there are people writing against it as well, but it's certainly up there in the discourse among quite educated people.
right.
And most trials will have some sort of trial pamphlet, and executions will have a pamphlet about them. So there's a lot around about witchcraft.
On that note, to go back to what you were talking about, I think right back at the beginning, you talked about it being one of the things that fascinated you. This is about women.
Yep.
So why is it women getting accused? Why is it the women at the hovel at the end of the road? Why is it the women that are particularly getting caught up in all of this?
If you find an answer to that,
Ooh,
can you let me know?
fair enough.
There are lots of theories around. I mean, the big sort of theory is about it's a misogynist crime, essentially, and it's fear of women with power, and fear of women on their own as well, although that's not always the case. It's also to do with the stereotype of a witch. If you go to different countries, witches look very different. There are areas in Europe where witchcraft is actually being a werewolf. And there are people who believe that they turn into wolves at night, or maybe they don't believe it, but certainly their neighbours do, and go out hunting. And that's predominantly a male form of witchcraft. If you go further east into sort of Poland and Russia, it becomes, again, more of a political crime, and you get shaman, and they're men. So there's also a lot to do, I would suggest, about the folklore in the country that you're looking at.
So this has become, in our culture, it's become the go-to metaphor if people feel that there's paranoia and persecution. Arthur Miller's play The Crucible does an awful lot of this, where he's comparing it obviously to a sense of looking for communists and McCarthyism. Do you think that that's overdone in the culture, that sense of looking for witch hunts, calling things witch hunts, or do you think it stems from a similar place in human nature and actually it's something that we do need to be wary of, and it is a similar motivation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe not so much in England, although in the 1640s you get Matthew Hopkins, who appoints himself Witchfinder General and marches round Essex, rounding people up. But certainly in Germany, where there were over 50,000 witches were executed, which is, quite a staggering number for something that today we perhaps don't believe exists.
Some of the torture devices they used were really grim. I mean, I looked into some of
the point of torture.
Yes, I know, but I know that's the point of torture. But the idea of it just it sends a shiver down your spine. I mean, I saw things like leg irons, thumb screws, all sorts of, obviously horrible things, as I said. But at the same time, what do you think made people, for 1 second, think that this form of torture was just justified? Do you think it was mainly the religious overriding aspect, or
I think
it was mainly political, or?
Well, that's an interesting question. So I think partly they were terrified. It's all very well that we don't believe it, but they did. They believed. Most people who were involved in the witch craze firmly believed that what they were doing was right, and they were saving people's souls, and therefore anything was justified.
And what do you think's the outcome of torture like that? Is the outcome to punish that person for being a witch? Is the outcome to get a confession?
Yeah, a confession.
A confession.
And names.
Right. Because they're so scared of who it could be around them.
Yeah.
And was there any limit on age? Like, were you seeing children being accused of being witches, or was it mainly older people? Or?
Mainly adults. Not really children. Although, again, depends where you were. There wasn't an interest. There were interesting. There were occasions in Germany again where children, not so much accused, but certainly they would be seen as almost victims that had been involved in it most of the time, in terms of someone else had managed to lure them into it and they didn't really know what they were doing. So yeah.
Well, just not to take it too far away from the UK, but you look at the Salem witch trials. There were children convicted in those trials. It certainly they're not off bounds, but I guess it's because they're so scared of the devil from Protestant or from Christianity at that time.
And we haven't really talked that much about the American. We've talked about the British. You've talked a lot about Germany and so on. What do you think about is there standout things in the Salem witch trials that make them qualitatively different from what we've talked about so far? Or are there parallels and similarities? What stands out to you?
I don't know a huge amount about the Salem witch trials actually, but yeah, they're essentially the British witchcraft tradition, but exploded, and they really go to town with their punishments. They squash someone under a stone and various things like that. And but it's all the tropes that you would see in a lot of British witchcraft cases.
Well, and one of the problems with Salem was it was so isolated from everybody else. And that was they think that was one of the main contributing factors, that people just got so paranoid and isolated from from civilization.
And it's a lot later actually than a lot of what's going on in Europe because of that reason. So they've gone over to America and then been very isolated in America and in that part of the world. And so the beliefs, I think, have existed longer and the paranoia being able to build.
Is it a useful lesson then? Because in some ways, as a historical episode, whether we think it ends there or whether those emotions carry on, it's hard not to think that it's just the worst parts of human nature. It's superstition, it's paranoia, it's prejudice, there's elements of sadism, extreme violence, misogynistic overtones, not even overtones, just outright misogyny in lots of cases. Is this, as an example, just a brilliant anti-example of everything that's humanist and decent and right? Or is that going too far?
I think it's very easy to say that from the 21st century. I think...
Hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, however misguided and misled and horrendous these people were, most of the time they were trying to do what they thought was right. And they were trying to protect their communities. But clearly, I'd like it on paper that I'm not advocating going out and hunting women as witches. That's not a good thing.
Dramatic outcome of the podcast.
It would be, yeah. Don't do it.
Will be studied for years to come. This one
I was
moment.
going to say the High Wycombe witch craze by 2021.
But you think when people get scared, you see it on social media. They try and chase down exactly what they're scared of, and you have what the media often calls witch hunts.
I was going to say, and then you call it the witch hunt.
You call it a witch hunt, but you see, it's definitely not beyond us in the 21st century. We just have different witches to hunt. And, you know, that's probably the lesson we take from this, is that often we get scared and try and chase down what scares us most, whether it's the devil 400 years ago or whether it's somebody on Twitter nowadays.
Very similar.
Very comparable indeed.
Well, that's absolutely a fair point. I just wondered, I heard a little birdie told me who may possibly, I should need to give a shout out to S3 because I may possibly have put it out to them to try and inspire me with some questions. And James in year 13, our previous podcast guest, hinted to me that there was something to do with witchcraft and fertility that you'd written about previously. So I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about that a little bit and unpack what on earth he might be talking about when he gave me that hint. If you can remember what you were talking about at the time.
So, there is a lot of work about German witchcraft. So Lyndall Roper would be the person to go and read. If you're interested in this, go and read Lyndall Roper because she's amazing. But she says that there is a lot of worry about women kind of being anti-women, and they are not fulfilling the role that a woman should be filling. So either mother or wife or none, essentially. And therefore, one of the key things that a woman should be doing is having children. And witches don't do that. And there's a lot then of question around how much symbolism within witchcraft is linked to fertility and having children, keeping children alive. It's a lot more prevalent in Germany. There's not actually that much crossover. Certainly in England you don't see witches killing many children, whereas in Germany there's quite a lot more infanticide put down to witchcraft. But it's, you know, things like you get your tropes of witches gathering and dancing around cauldrons from that sort of witchcraft, and riding on goats to sabbats, which are diabolic creatures, obviously. I mean, who doesn't see a goat and think, devil? And also things like sex with the devil and relationships that you might have with the devil that mean you no longer want men, and therefore that's another thing to do with fertility, and you are not you're not accepting the role that God gave for you to you.
And do you think that contributes to the fact that so many women accuse accused other women of being witches at the time. Do you think that there was that fear in women that or was it just the fact that everybody was just so scared of the devil or the powers that a witch could have?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think because they were trying to fulfil this role of a woman, in inverted commas, and so they wanted to protect that. And quite often, because of this link to fertility, things like crops and butter and animals and children were all kind of common targets, and quite a lot of those were things that women would have oversight of within the home, particularly things like churning your butter and looking after your children, brewing your beer. They were all women's jobs, so it was quite often women being affected, again in inverted commas, by the impact of witchcraft.
See, I'm always churning butter and brewing beer at home. That's just me. That's just a
pastime.
yeah.
I'm glad to hear it.
Classic bank holiday weekend for me. Really. Brilliant. Have you got any final things? Is there anything you think that we haven't given you the chance to talk about? Any particular things we've missed? Any myths you want to bust, or do you think we've, grilled you and turned the thumb screws enough on you by now?
I mean, you've not yet tied my hands and legs together and thrown me into a pond to test me.
We haven't really talked about all that. Do you
No.
fancy talking about that? Is that true? Did that happen?
Yeah.
Seriously, that was an actual thing that happened?
There are lots of tests for witchcraft. If you want to start your own witch craze, I can give you some tips about how to track them down. But there is a common misconception that ducking and swimming are the same things. So ducking, you essentially are tied to a stool, which is on a big lever, and then dropped into some freezing cold water of a pond or a stream, and then brought back out and then ducked again, however many times your punishment requires. And that is mainly for women who talk too much. That's a scold's punishment for people who don't do what their husbands tell them. With swimming, that's a test for witchcraft. So swimming is where they would tie your hands and feet together, a little bit like you were doing a mushroom float, except tied up so you can't swim away, and then again lob you in a handy body of water. And if you float, which most people do because they've got lungs, you're a witch. And if you drown or sink, you are not a witch. Usually, people didn't die. Okay, if they did sink, they'd be hoiked back out, and that would be fine. But occasionally, this did happen. But on the plus side, you weren't a witch, and therefore you were going to heaven. Other tests, they would do things like making you repeat the Lord's Prayer. Absolutely verbatim, like no mistakes. If you made a mistake, clearly you were possessed by the devil. And I don't know if you've ever tried to say the Lord's Prayer when your life's at stake, but however well you know something, it's really difficult to do.
Yeah.
Life or
I think
death
especially in
karaoke.
today's climate, with everybody using fillers every few words, it would be so difficult.
Yeah, exactly. Any so what? That was it. Not just words wrong, but if you stumbled, that was it. The other thing that they really like to do, and this was really, really common, would be to prick you. And that would be getting a needle and literally pricking you. And then if they found something on your body, like a freckle or a mole, that would be a particular point to prick. And if you didn't feel it, then you were clearly a witch, because that was where the devil had sucked your blood from you. That was where you'd made your pact with the devil, where the devil took your blood. So therefore, he's because he's the devil and kind, he'd inserted some form of anaesthesia at that point. He's considerate when you make a pact. He does. But they'd have certain places as well that they'd search for. So again, linking back to the fertility, it would tend to be on genitals and breasts and things like that, which they'd also have tricks about sort of when they pricked you and how they pricked you and things like that. So it wasn't just you'd you didn't notice someone sticking a needle in you. It would have been, they'd been going along and then you didn't notice a pinprick, something like that.
And this is where there's an element of sadism in that, surely, in the
Yeah.
choice of location, and a kind of psychosexual
Yeah.
idea that's probably for podcast extra, to be honest, the
Well,
late
yeah.
night version
Yeah.
of
Tune in
the
for
Ask
that.
podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a late night version of a witchcraft podcast that could be done.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah, but possibly for now, we'll end on the how to find a witch.
Yeah, brilliantly gruesome. I was certainly enchanted by everything you said. Mark. Sorry, I couldn't
Puns are
resist.
back.
I had to get a couple more in there, didn't I? I have to say thank you to our absolutely amazing guest, Mrs Helen Livingstone. I've learnt an incredible amount today that I'll be taking away. Don't worry, I'm not going to be testing any witches just yet. I'm trying not to use some of those torture techniques on some of my classes, but I can't really. Yeah, sorry, Dan. Sorry, this is your warning to get out of my way. But yeah, no, thank you to Helen. Really brilliant. Thank you to my co-host. Thank you to our fantastic production team and to our brilliant panelists, Ewan, Tom, you in your double role as both, and Dan, our returning member of the podcast. Please remember to follow us on JHGS English on Twitter or JHGS History as well. I remembered, Mr. Sorden told me off last time. Or you can subscribe to us on YouTube by searching for my name, Jenny Summers. I'll probably sort that out at some point and do that properly. And leave us a rating and review. And we even could be found on Spotify. So lots of places to find us. But really fantastic, everybody. Hope you had a lovely time listening. And tune in again next week for the next episode of the Ask podcast.
Hurrah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you then.